Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Anderson, and I would like to start by congratulating the Honourable Member for West Suffolk for securing this debate, and indeed also to pay tribute to his hard work as Chairman of the British Ukrainian Society. In his opening speech, he set out very clearly for us the bilateral relations between our country and Ukraine and an overview of that intriguing country's history and current situation. Positively, he also pointed out to the very good work being done to strengthen the links between our countries, and in particular also by the Honourable Member for Selby and his all-party group on the Ukraine. And indeed, it's particularly good to hear there will be a delegation of MPs visiting Ukraine later on this year. Of course, as with so many of these debates in Westminster Hall about various countries around the world, it's important to recognise that while the relationship with the country itself is important, we also benefit from many people, and in this case tens of thousands of Ukrainians who live, work and contribute to society here in Britain, and it's important to be aware of that community and the positive impact that it can have on the UK economy and society. I think so far, Mrs Anderson, we've had an excellent debate with contributions from the Honourable Member for Walsall South, my honourable friend from North Southwark and Bermondsey, the Honourable Members for Selby and Ealing North. I confess I have been somewhat lost along the way with some of the football metaphors, but that aside, I've certainly found it particularly interesting. In my brief remarks today, I'd like to touch on the relationship of Ukraine and the various international organisations, on the issue of energy, and then a couple of other issues before winding up. But first, I would just like to share with the members present my own experience of the Ukraine, which thankfully is slightly wider than just reading the rather excellent novel A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian by Marina Luika. Although one of the things in reading that, I bow to the Honourable Gentleman's superior pronunciation. No doubt it will look all right in Hansard, however.
I doubt it.
As long as I make sure the notes are given accordingly. But one of the things that brought that book to mind was in hearing the Honourable Member for West Suffolk talk about the famine in the 1930s, which indeed is one of the points that is raised in that book and described the horrors of. And I think it is clearly quite right that awareness is raised of that tragic period in Ukrainian history. Like with so many events of that nature, it is important that even once living memory does fade, that the rest of us do not forget, because that's the best opposition we have to it happening again. And indeed, the Honourable Member for West Suffolk also paid great tribute to WFD, Westminster Foundation for Democracy, of which he is a Governor-Director. And it's certainly excellent news that this extra money has been allocated to help WFD programmes in the Ukraine. My only visit to the Ukraine was in 2006, and it wasn't with WFD, but with a programme that was being run by the European Parliament and the National Democratic Institute, which is a sort of American version of WFD. And that was to assist with running a workshop called Win with Women. This was aimed at women politicians, both current and aspiring, within the Ukraine, and had training delivered by women parliamentarians from across Europe, and particularly from people involved in politics here in the UK. And it's interesting that in a country with obviously a very strong woman role model in the Prime Minister of Yulia Tymoshenko, there are sadly still very few women members of Parliament, and indeed I think the situation there is even worse than here in the United Kingdom, which is obviously itself not one of the best in the world. But my impressions of that training workshop were incredibly positive. There was a real feeling of excitement among the women politicians there, and I may say quite a few very strong voices that clearly will definitely be heard within the Rada. And my impression, although it was a very short visit, was that Ukraine is a country that is quite full of character and indeed increasingly confident. But indeed, that was only a short visit. So one of the advantages I always find of debates like this here in Westminster Hall is the opportunity to listen to the contributions from many other members and the benefit of their experiences and expertise on these issues. And my view is that you always learn something when you come to Westminster Hall, and today has been no different. Moving on to the relationships between the Ukraine and various international organisations. Obviously, the recent NATO summit brought the very welcome news that the negotiations can continue with regard to Ukraine joining NATO. I think the only slight note of disappointment was that exciting news was not brought to the House in the form of an oral statement, but was released in a written statement. But nonetheless, it certainly is something which is very welcome. And indeed, the future path looks very positive with, to quote from the post-summit declaration, a period of intensive engagement at a high political level, and with a progress report due by the end of this year. I think it is important, as has been touched on by various members in the debate, that we do manage, however, to calm Russian fears about NATO expansion. And in order to do that, I think we do need to demonstrate and to show that NATO is no longer about an extension of the Cold War, but has moved on to deal with the current challenges facing us, such as in Afghanistan, obviously, which indeed is a worry and concern for countries such as Russia as well. And that aside, however, it is very important that the declaration was very clear that it is not up to Russia to exercise any kind of veto over whether or not Ukraine joins NATO. And when they said, we reiterate that decisions on enlargement are for NATO itself to make, I would wholeheartedly endorse that point. The recent developments also as regard Ukraine signing up to membership of the World Trade Organization are also very positive, particularly as that might lead to a free trade agreement, as we hope, with the EU, and in due course, indeed, towards EU membership, if that is what the Ukrainian people want. And it's by no means definite what path they will choose. Public opinion is somewhat divided, and no doubt they will have very heated and engaged debates about their future with or not with the European Union, as we often have in our own country, indeed, and have experienced over the past few months. Turning then to the issue of energy, clearly just looking at a map, it is obvious that Ukraine occupies a key position strategically as regards energy supplies. And, of course, we all remember very well the dispute between 2005 and 2006, where gas supplies were heavily disrupted, not necessarily to the United Kingdom, but certainly to many of our EU neighbours. And this is obviously a great cause for concern going forward as competition for energy supplies increases. I think, as regards the specific problems, we would all agree it's only fair that Ukraine should, in time, pay a market rate for its gas supplies. But a sudden quadrupling of the price was something that was clearly always not going to be possible for the country to bear. And indeed, a smoother transition and phasing in of a market rate has to be the way forward. I think, obviously, it is concerning if we consider that Russia decides to use its energy supplies as a political tool. But before getting too overly worried about this, we should remember that it is a mutually dependent relationship between the EU and Russia. Yes, the EU needs Russian gas, but equally Russia needs the EU market for its gas. That said, if we do increase the number of pipeline routes between the sources of gas and the markets, then that can only aid our energy security. And in case of future disputes, we obviously would not want to see them happen. But if that were the case, we obviously have a responsibility to make sure that the rest of Europe is able to receive their energy. And it would be interesting to see, when the Minister sums up, whether he's able to discuss whether, when the recent Ukrainian delegation met with his colleague and the department, whether the issue of energy security brought forward any interesting points about how this could be secured in the future. And just to touch briefly on a couple of other issues, I think the Honourable Member for Selby characterised well the internal power struggles that there have been since 2004. And in preparation for this debate, I printed out a sort of timeline of the Ukraine, and just following it since December 2004 sort of is an incredibly complicated thing to do, with various people being Prime Minister, President, elections here, elections there, and somewhat looking like a case of musical chairs. I think we can hope now for a period of greater stability since the outcome of last autumn's elections, and that, one would hope, would enable the country to focus on the business of governing rather than the internal politicking, and let's just remain optimistic on that front for now. And finally, the issue of the Schengen Agreement, I think, is one that's just worth raising, that since December 7 this has been extended and now includes 24 countries, including the Eastern European states. So there's a huge border of the Schengen area with Ukraine. Just the border with Poland alone is 526 kilometres, which raises a potentially huge task for how to police this border. And I would be interested if the Minister has any early assessments, obviously it's only been a few months, as to how this is working and whether that's brought any problems with it. So in conclusion, Mrs Anderson, the relationship between the UK and the Ukraine is hugely important and indeed currently looks very positive. It's obviously important that the government should continue to build on that solid foundation, but I think it's also indeed important for members of Parliament to play our role and to make sure that within the communities that we represent we can forge and build links between the two countries.